Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. This is Football at 4.
Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, and it is brought to you by PropSwap, America's sports betting marketplace. Sell your sports bet and take your profit. Find out how. PropSwap.com. Download the PropSwap app today. Championship weekend, Eagles news, plenty of NFL. Geoff Mosher is here. And the guys over at InsideTheBirds.com and the Inside the Birds app have been very busy. Some Eagles news over the last couple of hours here, Geoff Mosher. So we'll start with that as we get ready for Football at 4. What's going on, Moshe?
Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well on this Friday, man. You know, it's Friday, but we're all kind of anticipating this storm. So the weekend feels like it's going to be a mush.
Yeah, I know. I thought it would be starting by now. I see it's been snowing in Philly. So far it's more like a nor'easter than a nor'easter, Mike. There's nothing going on here.
Yeah, nothing going on here, right. We had the weather guy from the press on earlier. He told us if you have dinner plans tonight around 7, you should be good from 7 to midnight-ish, that you can kind of do what you want to do. And then when you wake up in the morning, you might need to figure out how to get out of your house by that point.
Yeah, well, it won't be the first time we've been locked inside our house for the last 2 years. So,
well, let's start with some of the Eagles news today. You guys over at InsideTheBirds.com, I think, were the first on this. Ann Cunningham, who is an Eagles front office guy that most people probably don't really know who that is, but he is being tabbed for a possible assistant GM job with the Chicago Bears, and this is just another example of. You know, I know people don't like Howie Roseman in the Eagles front office, and they don't draft well, but the front office in Philly is typically a pretty well-respected place to find help.
Sure. I mean, Ian would be the third person this year, this offseason, I should say, to get a look by another team. And as sources have told myself and Adam, I mean, it's a pretty strong connection with him and Ryan Poles to the point where it looks like Ian's the front runner for that position to be kind of an assistant GM position. I believe that's the title that they're looking for. And that is a similar title that Ian interviewed for last year with the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers, excuse me, under Matt Rule, have a former Eagles executive in their front office named Patrick Stewart. And so there was a connection there, and Ian interviewed for a job down there. So Ian's well respected. You know, he was brought in not necessarily by Howie. Of course, Howie presides over everything, but he's really a guy that Joe Douglas brought in along with Andy Weidel, because those guys came up through the Baltimore chain like Joe Douglas did and were brought here when Joe was in charge of the scouting department. So Ian was brought here to be the director of college scouting. Excuse me. He worked his way up to assistant director of player personnel, and then last year was elevated to director of player personnel, which interestingly on this team is a position that he shares with Brandon Brown, who's also director of player personnel. And Brandon Brown got an interview with the Vikings for their GM vacancy.
Right. So this is the third front office member to have interviewed for a front office gig, 2 for a GM, 1 for an assistant GM this offseason.
That is correct. So, you know, Jeffrey Lurie did say at one point, I forget which press conference it was, he thought he had 5 future GMs, which, you know, you can poke fun at that a little bit. I don't know if he has 5 future GMs, but he certainly has people in his scouting department who are getting looks and getting consideration. Oddly enough, Andy Weidel, who is the number 1 guy in the scouting department and just number 2 under Howie Roseman, has not gotten yet that we've seen any kind of interview or consideration. But you know how these things work.
Yeah. So you know, right? And let's go to quarterback coach Brian Johnson, highly regarded from Florida when he came here to work with Jalen Hurts. And, you know, I think during the course of a year, you don't hear too much about the quarterback coach, but 34 years old. He was brought here to work with Jalen Hurts. They had worked together. He was at Florida in college, and he might be going from quarterback coach at 34 to offensive coordinator in Green Bay.
Yeah, that would be quite a monumental leap. So we'll see how that happens. You know, I imagine a lot of interviews are for guys who are seriously considered. A lot of interviews are for guys who are who pique your interest, and you want to get them in the chair and find out a lot about them. if not for this year, then down the road. So we will see with Brian Johnson. I mean, it's hard to say he gets the interview based on the great quarterback play alone, when the quarterback play was not great. It was okay, but the bottom, he did have a very good college career as far as a coach, I should say.
Worked. He was a pretty good quarterback schools. Too, by the way.
He was a pretty good quarterback. That's right, he was. So you can understand the interest there. And I think what's interesting is, like you say, he was brought in. You know, he had been with Jalen Hurts and everything like that in the past. He was hired before the Eagles traded Carson Wentz. So you know, I know that it looks like they kind of hired him to be the Jalen Hurts coach because of their history together, but I don't know if that's true or not, because Carson Wentz was still on the roster at the time.
That's right. You know, I don't. You know, you take a look at what his impact may or may not have been, but what you bring in a young guy like Brian Johnson, and you try to keep all those things paired together. Like, you try to have consistency, right? To have the same coach work with the same quarterback in the same offense, and that's the incubator of trying to grow success, right?
Sure. I mean, that's the idea. Of course, you're going to lose guys in the NFL. It happens all the time. But if we're going to use an example of recency bias, things looked great for Carson Wentz when he was working with John DeFilippo. But then when John DeFilippo moved on to, I want to say, where did he go right after?
John DeFilippo was the offensive coordinator in Minnesota, correct?
Yeah, that's where it was. Minnesota, correct. All of a sudden, then and Frank Reich leaves.
Got fired,
all of a sudden, you have different people. You know, coaching the position, and the play regresses. So of course, continuity is as long as it's good continuity, as long as you feel like your coaches are doing a good job and are adequate. You know, Joe Banner has been on with Adam and I on Inside the Birds a couple of times over the few years, and he did talk about the importance of a new coaching staff that has to bring in coaches kind of on the fly, who may just be available because they're not under contract at the time. You have to be able to recognize any mistakes you think you might have made in the hiring process and rectify them early, even at the expense of continuity, if you believe that they were mistakes.
Geoff, I know this time of the year, free agency, now I'm going off the top of my head here. I believe the legal tampering starts on the 14th of March and free agency opens on the 16th of March. But that doesn't mean that the rumors won't start flying. And I know one guy's that you guys discussed over on the Inside the Birds podcast, and as being thrown around by NFL executives, is DJ Chark as a player that could have some interest to this Eagles group. In fact, I think Adam mentioned that, hey, they looked at him to draft. They ended up taking Dallas Goedert instead. But here's a young guy who's now a free agent, and it seems that there's some dots you can connect that maybe the Eagles would have interest in DJ Chark.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the need for a veteran receiver who can play that X position is there. Also, you have the guy who drafted DJ Chark in Jacksonville working now for the Eagles, and Dave Caldwell. You have a guy who's thrown to DJ Chark now playing quarterback or backup quarterback for the Eagles with Gardner Minshew. So there's familiarity there, fills a void. So it makes a lot of sense from a lot of levels. The only thing is, when you look at Howie Roseman's history of free agent wide receiver signings since kind of having his power restored in 2016, he looks for the bargains. He has not paid the kind of money that you'll probably see Allen Robinson get on the free agent market, you know, like a 5-year, I don't know, $50-60 million. That's not been Howie's MO when it's come to wide receivers. He got Alshon Jeffrey on a 1-year deal because Alshon had the PED thing that year, and he had multiple injuries, and I think teams were afraid to get into bed with him long term. So Howie gave him a 1-year deal, but he probably gave him more money than anybody else would have been willing to give him over 1 year. So that's how he got Alshon, and then wound up re-signing him to a bit longer contract in the middle of the year. You look at Mike Wallace, Deshaun Jackson, Kamar Aiken. Trying to think if there are any other guys I can think of, but basically when he's been a bargain shopper at wide receiver in free agency. DJ Chark's coming off an injury, an ankle break, right? So it's possible teams might be scared to give him a long-term deal, and that's where Howie can kind of maybe come in with a 1 or a 2-year deal. But there's also, as much as we talk about the Eagles having cap space, I think the one thing that we don't talk about in that conversation is there are a lot of teams with cap space, and there are a lot of teams that have shown to be risky or risk averse sometimes with all that money. So DJ Chark is still young enough where you could see, even coming off an injury, where he may get a pretty decent deal. And I don't know if Howie will want to kind of compete with that.
Yeah, Pro Football Focus projects a 3-year, $13 million deal for a guy like Chark, because he is kind of, I guess, somewhere in limbo with that fractured ankle. He's coming off of a kind of a 2020 down year. He had a big year in 19, but took a step back. So, hey, who knows? Maybe Roseman finally says, hey, we've got to put a little bit more, because I got all these draft picks. So instead of drafting a guy, I'll spend a little extra on a guy.
Well, when you
especially
say,
a young guy.
Is it 3 years, $13 million total, or 13 a year?
13 per year average.
So kind of like a 3-year, $39 million contract.
Somewhere in that range, yes.
Yeah, so I could see Howie maybe going 2 years, but maybe a little bit more guaranteed money. We'll see. He has not given out a contract. This is relevant, right? Brandon Brooks just retired the other day. Brandon Brooks and Rodney McLeod got 5-year deals from the Eagles in 2016 as they were kind of rebuilding there. Since then, Howie Roseman has not given out a contract for, I believe, longer than 3 years to anybody, except unless he's restructuring. But I'm talking about free agents. And more so, you're seeing free agents not accept anything longer than a 3-year deal anyway, because they want to hit free agency again while they're still young. So this may work in some regards to the Eagles' advantage. They don't have to give out a long contract. And if it's not that much money, 3 years, 39, I guess we'll see. You know, I mean, to me, if you need, a lot of teams need wide receiver. And so it'll be interesting to see if teams could give more of that just to get DJ.
Yeah, he's 6'4", 4'3" speed. He's a bigger guy. Definitely a bigger guy, seemingly would fit pretty well with Smith. There's a good wide receiver class, though. So it seems like if you need to get a veteran receiver and you have some money, you're going to have your options. We know Devontae Adams, Chris Godwin, who's coming off a major injury, Mike Williams, Allen Robinson, Michael Gallup, Antonio Brown, if you want to get involved in that mess, Odell Beckham, Juju Smith-Schuster, Christian Kirk, DJ Chark, Will Fuller, Jamison Crowder. There's some more names, Cedric Wilson. I mean, there are names that they can really be in play for. This seems like the perfect match year for them to spend money at that position.
Well, actually, the way you mentioned so many names, it seems like the perfect year for Howie to continue to bargain shop and say, look, I'm not going to go out there and get Allen Robinson. I'm not going to get Chris Godwin. I'm not going to get who's the third guy? There was another big-time receiver. Godwin. Who is it?
Mike Williams.
Devontae Adams, right? And Mike Williams.
Devontae Adams as well.
But I can sit here and look at that middle class and say, wow, Juju is fine for us. It's not like they need a 1,500-yard, 10-touchdown receiver. You know, they've got Dallas Goedert. They got Devontae Smith. They feel good about Quez Watkins, as you heard Nick Sirianni say. We'll see what happens with Jalen Reagor. But, I mean, if they just got, again, even in 2016, they got Alshon, but then they went out and got Torrey Smith. You're just looking for, like, steady, reliable veteran receivers. And a bunch of guys you mentioned in that boat fill that role that you don't have to sit there and give, like, 3 to 4 year, $20, $30, $40 million contracts to.
Yeah, I think you're dead on there. Is you don't need Devontae Adams, but if you get one of those secondary players, because I guess the hope is that this player doesn't have to be better than Smith. He just needs to complement Smith.
Right, like a 1 to a 1A, like Torrey Smith to Alshon, because that year, not that everything has to be like 2017. But really, that passing offense was very spread around, and Zach Ertz was a big part of it. And I think Dallas Goedert can be an equally big part of next year's offense, just like we saw over the last 6 or 7 games of this past season. He can be a guy that catches 70 to 80, maybe a little bit more balls, and gets close to 1,000 yards, and is that central to what they do offensively, assuming, Mike, that next year's scheme is still kind of a West Coast looking offense, and they're not going to do something different and build like a Raven style offense. We don't really know what they're going to do.
No, but one guy you mentioned with DJ Chark was Gardner Minshew, and I'm interested to get your take on how do you see them adding a quarterback in the draft in trying to do what they did last year? They signed a veteran quarterback, traded for a veteran quarterback to have the ability to spin off one of those quarterbacks. So they added a draft pick because they had two veteran quarterbacks in their room. So we know they love to add quarterbacks. Do you anticipate them trying to draft one or maybe even sign another veteran? Do you think they would be making calls to try to move Minshew?
It depends on what they do. Yeah, all right, there's a couple of different scenarios. If they were to bring in a Russell Wilson or Deshaun Watson, right, then you're probably not going to have Jalen Hurts here. It's either one or the other, I would think. And in that case, you would want to keep Gardner Minshew as your backup. You have a year of him. He may not love that idea, but you've got a year of it, and he would be the first guy to play if one of those guys got hurt. And plus, Deshaun Watson, Mike, he might be suspended, so you may have to have Minshew for 4 or 5 or whatever games to lead your offense if Watson is your quarterback and is suspended. But let's put that aside because that's still we think is an unlikely scenario, but has to be discussed. I don't think they will use a trade up into the top 10 to get a quarterback. I think it's more likely they'll draft a quarterback sometime second, third, fourth round, something like that, because they've told you they view that position, as the most important spot. It doesn't matter if they're going forward with Jalen Hurts; they're going to have one. And so what that guy would open up camp, I would think, as the number 3. And so Minshew would still be number 2, but it might see a scenario where by the trade deadline, you can trade Minshew or somebody gives you an offer for Minshew coming out of training camp and you're comfortable with the guy that you drafted then becoming your backup. So it gives you the optionality on either keeping Gardner or being able to trade him if the value is there.
Yeah, I think he's an interesting name to keep an eye on because you wonder, are there teams that are going to call about Gardner? Are they going to call and say, hey, what are you looking to get for Gardner? And if Howie has, fourth round, and someone says, oh, he's a quarterback, fourth round, he played well enough, boom, what's that threshold that you say we'd rather keep him as opposed to, hey, you giving us another asset, we'll take it?
The reason why I think Gardner would have value even more so than normal is because so many teams need quarterbacks. So some teams might view Gardner as a bridge quarterback, someone they want to come in and compete, see if they can start, see what they're all about. And then other teams, Mike, as we're seeing, are really placing a higher priority on having a good backup quarterback. And so if another team says, here, I'll give you some good value because we want Gardner Minshew to be our backup, then the Eagles would probably be silly not to do the deal, especially if they've drafted or brought in another quarterback and have 3.
Geoff, obviously, and, you got a bunch happening this offseason because you don't know what's going to happen with Jonathan Gannon and his situation. But how about the fact that McCown is getting a second interview with Houston?
Yeah, Houston does things unconventionally. I'll tell you that.
Right? So Josh McCown is getting a second interview, which I guess if you were a fan out there that wanted Gannon gone, that's not good news because Gannon was seemingly the front runner in Houston, and now they're bringing Josh McCown back for a second interview to be the head coach possibly out there. But the Eagles are in a weird spot because if Gannon's gone, they got to hire a new defensive coordinator and then figure out what the scheme and everything. So this is something that they got to keep an eye on.
Well, yeah, you know how we talked about this is the year to want a wide receiver, a veteran wide receiver.
This is also the year
if you're going to lose your defensive coordinator where you're kind of all right with it because you've got Vic Fangio hanging out there. You have Mike Zimmer hanging out there. Wade Phillips, I mean, he's always still bouncing around. I mean, I feel like that there's some pretty decent names out there, and I think there's another who I just can't think of right now.
Yeah, Wink Martindale is out there.
Yeah, Don Martindale, right. Yeah, another one. So, I mean, this would be the year, and I feel like the Eagles would be pretty aggressive in trying to get one of those guys if that were the case.
Yeah, I think a lot of fans are actually hoping for that to be the case because there are some veteran – you know what's interesting is that the league – I tweeted this out earlier. Doug Peterson, do you think Peterson's going to get passed over this time around?
I mean, it sure appears that way, right? There's 10 openings. He's had, 2 interviews and not gotten either job?
2 or 3, right.
Or not yet?
Not a lot of buzz around his name. I feel like Peterson, he was late to the foray to get a head coaching job, got the job, won the Super Bowl at the end of that era, and then the game has kind of changed since, 2017 to where we are now, and it's like his style of coaching is already kind of old. And, you know what I mean? He got into the window, won his Super Bowl, and then kind of came into an era where he didn't evolve with it and might be looked at as kind of an old school guy. It just seems that every team is so trying to find the next thing, and that maybe he missed the boat on that.
It's possible. The one area that would hold me back, though, is that even though he's not old, but he's not young either, like your Brandon Staley's or your Jonathan Gannon's, but he does fit the criteria for the teams that are looking for someone who's progressive-minded, analytically driven, aggressive on fourth down, innovative offensively from a how you see offense, how aggressive you are. He does fit that bill more than most coaches his age. I mean, God, Kyle Shanahan, he's done great. I'm not going to slam him, but he's terrible with the whole when to go for it and not go for it on fourth down and 2-point conversion. He's constantly considered one of the worst coaches in the league as far as do the analytics match the gut decision there or the decision I should say, and they don't. But Doug is right up there with any young kid right now who's got all the charts and the analytics that tell you what to do in certain game scenarios.
He's Geoff Mosher. Check out the Inside the Birds podcast, all the offseason news and conversation. We all love hearing what's next. Well, it's already here, and the Eagles could be losing not one but two parts of their staff, John Gannon and now Brian Johnson, and maybe a front office member as well. He's Geoff Mosher. Have a good weekend, man, and we will catch up with Moshe on Monday. Thanks, bud.
Stay safe, Mike. Thanks.
All right, that's Geoff Mosher at Geoff Mosher NFL. And that is another edition of Football at 4 here on the Sports Bash Live, 97.3 ESPN.